Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are cracking open one of the absolute biggest mysteries in modern retail history. In 2018, the unthinkable happened. Toys R Us shuttered every single one of its 1,500 stores in the United States. Just like that, one of the most recognizable, beloved retail brands on Earth was just gone. Now, if you're like most folks, you probably point the finger squarely at Amazon. But what if I told you the obvious suspect absolutely did not act alone? So let's dive into this. We're basically going to treat this explainer like a corporate autopsy. Because you see, the truth behind the sudden death of this retail titan is far stranger, much more complex, and frankly, a whole lot more painful than simply losing out to e-commerce. We're going to use the data and the historical records to uncover the bizarre reality of what actually took down Geoffrey the Giraffe.
Act 1. The victim in their prime.
Before we figure out how it died, we gotta remember just how massively it lived. I mean, for anyone who grew up in the last half-century, Toys R Us wasn't just a store, right? It was a childhood ritual. And at its absolute peak, Toys R Us sold 1 out of every 5 toys in America. Think about the sheer scale of that dominance for a second. 1 in 5! It was the destination. It was the place literally every kid begged their parents to take them to on birthdays, holidays, or honestly, any excuse they could conjure up.
By 1990, they controlled a massive 25% of the U.S. toy market share. And it all started way back in 1948 when Charles Lazarus came home from World War II with a simple hunch. He noticed soldiers were coming home, starting families, the early days of the baby boom. He realized parents really only buy one crib, but they buy toys endlessly. So he stacked his store floor to ceiling with toys, creating an absolute juggernaut.
Toys R Us basically invented the concept of the category killer. Their promise was super simple but totally revolutionary. Every toy, always in stock. You didn't have to hunt across 5 different mom-and-pop shops anymore. Because of this unparalleled inventory, they became an invincible institution for 6 decades, and they completely wiped out smaller competition along the way.
Act 2. The first cuts. Walmart.
As we move into the late 90s, our autopsy gets its first real suspect. Because as dominant as Toys R Us was, institutions can start to crack from the outside in. And the first major wound didn't come from a computer screen, it came from Bentonville, Arkansas, using a tactic known as a loss leader. In 1998, Walmart quietly overtook Toys R Us as America's #1 toy retailer by doing the unthinkable. They were willing to sell toys below cost, literally losing money on them just to get families through the doors. Because, well, once you're inside, you're going to buy groceries, clothing, and electronics to make up the difference.
See, Walmart was a generalist. They could easily subsidize cheap toys with the profits from their other departments. But Toys R Us was a specialist. They had no other departments. They structurally had to make a profit strictly on toys. It was a brutal pricing war, and Toys R Us was just fundamentally incapable of fighting back using Walmart's own rules.
Act 2 continued. The self-inflicted wound. Amazon. Facing all this intense pressure from Walmart, Toys R Us desperately needed a win. They had to modernize, find a new edge. So, in the year 2000, they signed a deal to be the exclusive toy seller on Amazon. They literally handed their entire digital destiny over to a third party. But Amazon quietly violated the contract, allowing other toy sellers onto the platform anyway. Toys R Us rightfully sued, won a $51 million settlement, and walked away in 2004.
Sure, Toys R Us eventually sued and won that $51 million. But the true cost? It was absolutely catastrophic. They lost 4 irreplaceable years. While the internet was completely reshaping retail from the ground up, Toys R Us built zero online infrastructure of their own. They bet on a competitor to do it for them. And man, it cost them the future.
Act 3. The fatal blow.
All right, this brings us to the heaviest, most devastating part of our autopsy. While Walmart dealt the first cuts and the Amazon deal was a major self-inflicted wound, the ultimate killer wasn't another retailer at all. It was leveraged debt from Wall Street. In 2005, 3 massive private equity firms, KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty Trust, purchased Toys R Us for $6.6 billion. Now, the problem wasn't actually the fact that the company was bought. No, the fatal blow came from exactly how these firms chose to finance this massive transaction.
The sources actually use this incredibly vivid metaphor to explain it. They say the debt was, quote, loaded onto them like a backpack filled with bricks. The private equity firms borrowed the money to buy the company, and then they turned around and placed that massive debt directly onto the Toys R Us balance sheet. The company didn't choose to take on this debt. It was just strapped onto their back. Pre-buyout, Toys R Us was carrying about $1.8 billion in debt. Pretty manageable, right? But post-buyout, it skyrocketed overnight to $5 billion. The company was immediately suffocated under a mountain of financial obligations that it had absolutely no say in creating.
The daily reality of that burden is just staggering. $400 million, and that was just the annual interest payment alone. Every single year, almost $500 million evaporated just paying interest. That was money that could not be used to build better websites, it couldn't be used to remodel stores, and it certainly couldn't be used to fight back against Amazon's rise.
Act 4. The Decay and the Collapse.
So, what happens to a beloved magical brand when there is absolutely zero money left to protect its magic? Well, decay sets in, and it sets in fast. At their peak, Toys R Us sat on over $2 billion in cash reserves. By 2017, that had plummeted to just $300 million. Because of the suffocating debt, the aisles became outdated, the layouts were confusing, and their website was incredibly clunky. And this was happening right at the exact moment Amazon Prime was offering effortless checkout and free 2-day shipping.
It all led to this really shocking paradox. In September 2017, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy, despite the fact they were still generating $11.5 billion a year in sales. I mean, people were still buying toys, but mathematically, it just didn't matter. They were buried under $7.9 billion in total debt. They simply couldn't out-earn the weight of those bricks in their backpack.
The fallout from the 2018 liquidation was devastating. After a catastrophic holiday season where suppliers totally panicked and shelves just sat empty, lenders forced the end. Over 30,000 employees lost their jobs. Suppliers were left holding the bag for $800 million in unpaid bills. The human and economic collateral damage here was profound. Our autopsy does end on a slightly bittersweet note, though, because today, the brand actually survives in a much quieter form. You can find small Toys R Us sections inside Macy's stores, there are some flagship locations like at the Mall of America, and globally, it still generates about $2 billion. But those cathedral-sized, standalone toy stores we grew up with, those are entirely gone.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we can see that Amazon and Walmart were really just accessories to the crime. The true killer was an unbearable debt load that completely froze them in time. I'm going to leave you with this to think about. What is your most vivid Toys R Us memory? And looking at this autopsy, do you think the brand can ever truly recapture the magic it once had? Let me know what you think and keep on learning.